there has to be consequence. You know, one of the things people in the world that struggle with coming to faith is the concept of forgiveness. They say, somebody hurt me, they did this thing against me, and now I have to forgive them according to your faith? That essentially says what they did is okay. But what they miss is that there is forgiveness. Forgiveness does not always negate the consequence. Sometimes these consequences are for us. Sometimes they get passed down to other generations. Something to think about. Obedience. So as the portion continues, Moses shares his lesson with the people by calling them to obedience, right? I recognize I was disobedient. So now I'm going to remind all of you, as you enter the land, to be obedient. So despite his failure, he graciously and humbly begins to equip the next generation to enter the land. If we read Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 1 through 6 here, it says, "Now Israel, listen to the laws and rulings I am teaching you in order to follow them so that you will live. Then you will go in and take possession of the land that Adonai, the God of your fathers, is giving you, in order to obey the mitzvot of Adonai your God, which I am giving you. Do not add to what I am saying, and do not subtract from it. You saw with your own eyes what Adonai did at Baal Peor, that Adonai destroyed from among you all the men who followed Baal Peor. But you who stuck with Adonai, your God, are still alive today, every one of you. Look, I have taught you laws and rulings, just as Adonai my God ordered me, so that you can behave accordingly in the land where you're going in order to take possession of it." So there is a prohibition here not to add or remove anything from His Torah, anything from His law. And this is something that Yeshua always railed against. It's the traditions of men have always violated this. It's right here in Scripture. Don't add to, don't take away. And yet we get traditions from Judaism to Christianity to Catholicism. We're adding, taking away, adjusting, tweaking His word. And we justify this because we're accomplishing, or we think we're accomplishing, what He's commanded us to do. There is a Hebrew term called Gezerot, if I'm saying that correctly, but it's essentially a rabbinic fence law, right? It's an extra law that we put around the commandment so that you don't break the commandment, right? Seems like a good intention, right? I don't want you to break the commandment, so let me put a layer of protection around this. Because if you don't violate that law, you won't violate the other one. But here's the problem. When you put a fence around something, a fence has the good intention of protection, yet by its very nature, it obscures that which is protected. Yes?
I think probably one of the best examples is the first commandment he gave.
You're absolutely right. And I think one of the best examples of that is the very first commandment that was given in the garden, because when Eve was talking to the serpent, she said that not only were they not to eat of the fruit, they were not to even touch it. And that was not the commandment that God had given, but we assume perhaps that's how Adam related, since he's the one that heard the command, he related that to Eve in that manner. But don't even touch it.
Yeah.
Right? And so that became a stumbling block for even, in one sense, of the temptation, because some of the sages say that Hasatan, or the serpent, accidentally, on purpose, nudged her so that she actually touched the tree, and therefore, I'm sorry. Oh, hey, you're still alive.
Yeah. And that's the thing. When you add to or remove from the Torah, then logically that leads to distortion. It leads to distortion of the Torah. And where does distortion lead to? Disobedience. So we have to be very careful how we implement the Torah in our lives. I believe we have a lot of freedom when it comes to the commandments. You know, a lot of them, it's do this, don't do that, you know, that kind of thing. And it's kind of left up to us how we implement that in many situations. In some situations, it's not. It's very clear. This is how you are to do this. There's a whole set of mitzvot that they just don't logically make sense. But God says, I don't need you to understand how this works. I need you to be obedient. See, the call to obedience is underscored by the significance of the relationship between Adonai and his people. Right? Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. We'll kind of jump ahead here a little bit. Verses 3 and 4. It says, Adonai did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us who are all of us here alive today. Adonai spoke with you face to face from the fire of the mountain. See, this underscores this special relationship that we have, right? The Father communicated with his people in a way that nobody had seen before. Right? They came out of Egypt with its multiplicity of gods and different idolatry and all this other stuff, but no God ever spoke out of the midst of the fire like that. No God spoke to them face to face, panim el panim. See, the Torah wasn't received as just some casual communication, right? It wasn't like, hey, there's a new governor in town, here's a new set of rules, right? Somebody else got elected, so we're going to tweak some things. You know, read it if you got time. No, this was the Torah. The law was given to them. And it was given intimately. As a husband speaks to his wife, let me communicate something from my heart to you. Right? This isn't shooting the breeze with your colleagues. It's special communication. Idolatry was forbidden. And it was especially egregious given that special relationship. Torah goes on and tells us that God is a jealous God, Elkanah. He will not abide our devotion to another idol. Right? He won't deal with it. Even for us today, if it's the idol of human effort. You know, we can stand and rest on our laurels and say, hey, we've got the Torah, we've got the law, we've built all these things, right? We're God's people. And yet, if we're not following him in that intimate way, if we're not receiving his law as an intimate communication, I don't know. Let's see. Equipping the next generation. I want to kind of double back a little bit, back to Deuteronomy chapter 3 here. But Moses was charged with equipping the next generation. Specifically, Joshua in this instance. He was to impart the lessons learned so he could equip and aid Joshua to bring the people in. Right? I can't go in myself. You're taking the people in. It's your responsibility, and as a leader, I'm going to help you get there. See, he enabled Joshua to continue the work that he was not allowed to do. So sometimes when we don't reach this goal that we're striving for, we have to kind of check ourselves. I can't give into bitterness or resentment because there's somebody that's going to do that work. And if I'm aware of it, what can I do to sow into their life to help them to achieve that goal so they can avoid some of the mistakes that I made? You know, one of my frustrations in ministry that I've seen just throughout the years is there's a lot of ministries, great teachers, great pastors, great leadership. They have zero plan for succession. It's not even on the list. They can tell you about the budget for next year, the building plan, the direction that they want to take the people, the community, their expectations for growth. Nobody will tell them, or they'll never tell you what their plans are if they don't wake up tomorrow, because they don't have any plans. No plan for succession. That's a failure. Because at the end of the day, we live in flesh. We're not going to be able to go as far as what we may want to go. That's just the reality of it. We need to be sowing into the next generation. Who is going to continue the work when we're gone? See, the Torah portion describes Adonai as Elkanah, a jealous God, right? He jealously guards his bride. As leaders, we have a similar responsibility to guard, which we could say is to protect and equip the next generation, to guard them so that they can go forward. They can go further than we can. The responsibility of the next generation, I'm kind of looking at you guys because you're all sitting over here, is to be open to that instruction, to be teachable to that instruction. If you look at Joshua, if you go back from Deuteronomy 1 all the way through 3, you always see Moses, then you see Joshua, right? Moses is doing stuff, and then here's Joshua. Moses is doing this other thing, then here's Joshua, right? Joshua was recognized by Moses. He stood out. That's where you guys come in. Your job is not just to be here, to be present. You need to kind of stand up and be counted in that sense, right? You're the next generation. And not only was Joshua recognized by Moses, he was available to Moses. See, Moses couldn't impart into him if he didn't recognize him or he wasn't available. And so my challenge to you, being the young generation, the next generation of MNLT here in this room, is who are you learning from? Who are you being mentored by? Right? When you think about the calling that God has placed on your life, where the Father wants you to go, right? Whatever that is there somebody here in this community that has done something similar, is doing that thing that you can glean from, that you can learn from? If you don't have somebody mentoring you, it can get dangerous. Because who do you have speaking into your life? And the challenge to us as leaders, are we creating space for the next generation? If one of these wants to come to us and say, hey, I've got a question, I'm interested in this, I want to learn about this, I see you've gone here before me, and I want to follow in your footsteps and keep going, what can you tell me? Do we have time? Legitimate time? Are we making space in our lives for that kind of interaction? Because if we don't, they're going to find it somewhere. God willing, another righteous source. But the world is all too quick to fill that void. Cities of refuge, we'll just kind of skim over that, but we're given a list of 3 of the 6 cities of refuge, Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan, for the 3 different tribes. And then the 6 cities were Kadesh, Shechem, Hebron, Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan. And you can see that in Joshua chapter 20. But that would just kind of gloss over that. I don't have too much to speak on for that. Now, the Torah. Moses warned the Israelites not to forget Adonai after they entered the land. To avoid assimilation. I still think that's one of the biggest challenges for the church today, is to avoid assimilation. You know, if we're to be a nation of kings and priests, they don't look like the world, they don't act like the world. They're different. A king does not act like a commoner. He's a king. A priest does not act like a commoner. They are a priest. We are to be marked and separate, and we should live our lives accordingly. A lot of times that's going to create uncomfortable situations for us. But that's the deal. If you want to be a king or a priest in God's kingdom, you're going to look different. So assimilation. He goes on to tell them to remember that they were his chosen people and that they are to follow the Torah. See, in this Torah portion, the Torah itself is the central object, right? I was disobedient, I can't go in, you guys are going in, let me give you some tools to equip you. The Torah. It's the central object. It's the lifeline of connection to the Father. Who would we be as a religious community if we did not follow the Torah? What would distinguish us from everything else that's out there? There's this curious phrase, from the midst of the fire. It's repeated 3 times in chapter 5 alone. Anytime you see a repetition like that, it's kind of your cue to pay attention, right? There's something here. So God speaks to them from the midst of the fire. This ethereal voice, almost out of the void, right, is communicating the Torah, communicating to his people. Nobody's ever seen anything like this before, but it underscores that special relationship. It also shows that God exists beyond the physical, which was a big deal because you think about, where did they just come out of? Egypt, where you had a God for everything, right? Manifested in a statue, an image, what have you, right? And God says, no, I don't operate that way. I'm different. They're given the 10 sayings, the 10 commandments. And this is interesting. Many of you probably know this. You can take the first 5 commandments and put them in one category: how to love God. The second set of commandments, how to love people. And what do our Christian friends always tell us? Well, Yeshua says you only have to obey 2 commandments, right? Love God, love people. How do we do that? How do we unpack that? It's not an untrue statement, but I can't determine myself what it means to love God, as many have. I can't determine myself what it means to love people because my definition might be different than your definition. And now all of a sudden, we're loving one another, and yet somehow your love towards me doesn't feel so great, and my love towards you is not that great. We're not speaking the same language. We need a standard. The Shema. The essence of the Shema is not only to listen, right? Not just to hear, but to understand and obey. Right? Don't just take the information in, do something with it. There is only one God. Okay, I understand that. I've taken that. What do I do with that? How does that impact me? How does that impact how I walk out His law? See, it separates the Hebrew faith as one of monotheism, versus the polytheism of Egyptian culture. Right? And even our application today. There is only one God. I don't have the right to have other gods in my life if I'm serving the one true God. Now, for some of you, you may be a little more well-versed in this. I'm still kind of learning this. The mitzvot of tefillin and mezuzah. And it's interesting to me, mezuzah, right? Most people that I've come across with have adopted this, no problem, right? And we've adopted this, we'll put the mezuzah on our doorposts, right? It's got the scriptures in it. And no problem. Nobody really, you don't get pushback on that. And that's fine. I'm not here to throw stones at that at all. I would say the general acceptance is based on two things. It's easy to acquire and it's easy to implement, right? I can jump online, wherever. I can buy mezuzah. I can nail it to my door. I'm done. I'm good. But now tefillin's different. Why don't we see Messianic congregations adopt this? I've been studying a little bit. I'm just kind of getting my feet wet, so I'm just letting you know I'm not speaking with authority on this at all. Just some few things that I've observed. And in my experience, there's a general dismissal of this commandment. Why is that? Well, one, it's difficult, right? You've got all these rules about how it's made, where to get it from, how to tie it, right? The little boxes on your forehead and on your arm, right? If you guys know what I'm talking about here. It's expensive to acquire. Have you ever looked at what a kosher tefillin costs? I mean, you're starting around $300, and it goes up from there. That's a fair amount of money for most people. And then the other thing, and this is really what's interesting to me, it says you should bind them on your forehead and your arm as a sign. And this is where the debate comes in. So there's three predominant views. The Christian view says that's for Jews only. It's done away with. It's under the cross. We don't have to worry about it. Okay. The Messianic view says it's optional. It's not necessarily required. You can, you may, but you don't have to. And then the Judaism view says it's for Jews only, and it is a commanded physical action. Now, this is where, like I said, I'm just now studying this, but some of the early references I've come across suggest that it was worn only by the Pharisees, so it would be only for those in the priesthood. And generally, it was not worn by women, so it sounds like the ladies get a pass. So Philo, a Jewish philosopher, he concluded that the command was metaphorical. He said, no, it's just a sign, right? So you don't necessarily have to do this physical action. Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, he says it was metaphorical. That was his understanding. And so his thing was, you just remember Torah in thought and deed and not physically. So I just wanted to highlight this. It's like, we talk about what's the command, right? To bind them on your forehead, your heart. How do we implement that? We have to be careful. Do we follow the rabbinic way? Maybe. Do we say, no, it's just symbolic and we just need to keep these things in our hearts and minds? Maybe. But we should approach these things with fear and trembling, right? What's the verse? Walk out your faith with fear and trembling. Don't be passive with it. Don't be soft. There is one God, and He's jealous. And I'm running out of time here. So the half Torah is Isaiah 40, 1 through 26, and that is Nachmanu, and that is the first half Torah of consolation. There's 7 total. We got them up there. There's 7 total. We're not going to go through any of this. You can check that out on your own if you wish. I do want to wrap up here in our Brit Hadashah in Matthew 23. Actually, let's go there because there's one verse I want to read real quick. Matthew 23, verse 39.
Do we have time for a question?
Yes, let me get past this verse and then we will do that. He says, "For I tell you from now on, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of Adonai.'" And this goes back to that Hester Panim, right? The hidden face, right? God spoke to us face to face, intimate communication. But what happens? When we walk in disobedience, He turns His face from us. He hides His face. And so, if I can't see God's face, I have to ask myself, am I walking in disobedience? Am I walking in obedience? Because I don't want to live in such a way where I can't see God's face, where I can't hear His voice, I can't see His word in my life. So, some highlights from Parasha Vaetchanan, and if you have a question, I think we have a few minutes.
Yes, thank you. This relates to the striking of the rock. The passage, this wasn't the first time they were without water, right? And not the first time also that water came out of a rock. Mm-hmm. So in Exodus 17, in those verses, God actually commands Moses to strike the rock.
Okay. Oh, to strike, yes.
He actually commands him to strike the rock with his staff, with the staff in his hand. So what's different? Now, he did say, speak to the rock this time. One thing that's not different is that the people were complaining, just as we were then. And even back then at that time, Moses said, what am I going to do with these people? He was obviously frustrated. But you look at Numbers 20, and the very first verse, Numbers 20, mentions the death of Miriam. Yeah. So this is actually near the end. Moshe has been faithful throughout all those years. Miriam has died. I don't fully know the tradition around that, but somehow there was a connection between Miriam and this rock that followed the people around and provided water. Mm-hmm. And in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 22, that whole section, but especially verses 3 and 4, states that rock was Yeshua, the Messiah. Yeah. And so I'm trying to put all that together and understand what's happening. It seems like one of the aspects here was related to Moses, kind of like at the end of his rope, so to speak, because Miriam has died. Yeah. Aaron's still living, but he's going to die soon too. And now, of course, Moshe. And after almost, 40 years, 38, maybe 37, I don't know exactly what the years would be, but it's been a long, long time of wandering. And we've seen all this that has happened. So there we are. I say, so what changed? I think you did a good job of presenting that, but
Yeah, I think, and that's something I've always kind of struggled with too, because it seems on its face very unfair, right? You've got faithful Moses. He's been dealing with these people for all this time, at the end of his life, and you're literally just about to cross the finish line, right? And then one thing happens. One thing happens. Speak to the rock versus striking the rock. When, as per your point, he struck the rock before, right? But God changed the parameter of the commandment. And when we violate those parameters, it affects how, especially as leaders, how when people are watching us, it affects the holiness of God, right? Because now we're presenting God as less holy. And God says, nope, that's the line. That's the line. I understand all that you've done, so in my grace, I'm going to allow you to see the land, but you're not crossing over with your generation.
we see Miriam. We don't see Miriam as much as certainly as Moshe or Aaron, but she plays a prominent role, and she was her celebration, her leadership is clear, and there's an aspect of all this time they were traveling, and they got water from this rock, and then they don't have it anymore. She's died, and she's dead. For some reason, she had something. There was some gift. There was some relationship with God. Now she learned her lesson and her place, right? Mm-hmm. But she still had a place.
Yeah.
And she was able to bring some level of closeness, grace, relationship in that, maybe even mitigate the frustration that Moshe often felt. And she understood. She had learned her lesson of humility, and she was watching Moshe with humility. I don't know that I have any answer to that, but somehow there's got to be some sort of connection there. And Moshe just basically loses it. And it's uncharacteristic of him, who has been so humble, but he loses it here.
Yeah.
And God calls him to account for it.
Yeah.
So it's important for us it's a powerful lesson for us, because
Absolutely.
who was as close? Who was as humble? Who was humble as Moses? Who was as close to God as humble, face to face? And yet he too is judged and falls short.
Yeah. It's another.
Throughout Scripture, even the way that Yahweh created man and woman, and He brings them together as one. It is what you see in the physical is also same in the spiritual, and that's the one commandment. The fifth commandment says that it comes with the promise: if you honor and obey, your days will be long upon the land. So the same way is in the physical is the same in the spiritual as well.
That's a good point.
Yeah, a thought came to me when, we're trying to understand, Moses was allowed to strike the rock that one time, and this time he was asked to speak to it. And, the parameters changed. I just wonder, because biblical history is future prophecy, and could this rock that flowed rivers of living water represent the Messiah? And the first time he came, he was struck, and through his death brought living waters. The second time he comes, he's going to rule and reign from Mount Zion, and he won't be struck this time. He will be. It says, "All nations shall flow to Jerusalem to hear the law, the Torah of Yahweh." So, maybe that's a connection there. The other thing is in James, it speaks to this concept of how destructive anger, the actions that come from anger, can be. It mentions here in chapter 1 and starting in verse 19, it says, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath." And I got a cross-reference here of Ezekiel 5:2-6. And then verse 20 it says, "For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God." So we know that anger and wrath, there's no good fruit that can come out of that when it comes from man. You know, with Yahweh, it's a different. It's different, but with man, it never has a good ending. And so that's another lesson that I've always, and it's an area that I have to work on and deal with. But anger can keep you out of the kingdom. Anger can keep you, and the Bible says, "Make no friendship with an angry man." So it's an area that we must, submit ourselves and rely on the Holy Spirit to change that heart that's within us, so that we don't exhibit, the anger. And so, just a couple thoughts.
Yeah. No, this is interesting, the connection between the rock, being Yeshua, because you study that out and it talks about the miraculous nature of the rock would literally follow them through the wilderness, right? It's a pretty wild concept. But, per your point, to strike the rock, right, Yeshua was crucified once. When he comes back, we're not crucifying him again. That would be highly inappropriate, right? Even Paul talks about that. If you claim that you have Yeshua, right, you've accepted his sacrifice, and you go on sinning, you're trying to crucify him over and over and over, and it just doesn't work out. So, yeah, maybe there's some connection to that. It's a very interesting story, and it's just, to me, it's interesting that, Moses, so humble, so righteous, right? Saw God face to face to the point where he had to wear a veil because his face was glowing from being in the presence of God. I can't say that, right? I don't think any of us can say that. And yet, he steps just over the line just a little bit, from our viewpoint. And that's it. God says no. And I wonder if he was not the leader of Israel, if he was just some guy from one of the tribes did that, would he have more grace? But because of his office, because he was the leader of Israel, right? What does it talk about for teachers, right? Teachers, be careful. You're held to a higher standard. Leaders are held to a higher standard, right? If I'm not in a leadership position or anything like that, I don't have any responsibility. If I step out of line, I might get my hand spanked. Right? But if I'm leading and I step out of line, now a whole bunch of people are looking at me and they're following my example. Stakes are much, much higher. So I wonder if that had something to do with it. Maybe, maybe not.
I was just thinking of how you were talking about the Teflon. I also don't know a lot about it, but when I heard you speaking of that and the commandments and the judgments and the statutes, I just feel like it's a physical representation for us to always have the commandments in the front of our mind at all times, because you could tie that to Revelation, where a lot of people will speak to, they're afraid of the mark of the beast, but really we should be more aware of the mark of Yahweh, because we see in Revelation those are the ones that are protected. And how you get that mark of the Yahweh on your forehead is by observing the commandments, keeping the statutes and the judgments. So that's just something I was relating to when you were speaking on the Teflon. So
Yeah. No, I think we're out of time. No, I'm just teasing you.
Okay, so I'll make it really quick. Speaking of tefillin, again, it's pretty vague how we followed this command. Actually, they found a bunch of tefillin in the Qumran caves.
Oh, really?
So we know the Essenes also wore tefillin.
That's interesting. I did not know.
Pretty interesting. But that said, that's for your walk. I don't always. This is something that I'm like, this is something we should pray about on an individual level. I had the opportunity one time, a friend of mine brought tefillin for me to wear, and it was an interesting experience because you put the box on your head, you put it on your arm, and you have to tie it a certain way, but you have to tie the strap so tight that when you take it off, you can see the marks. And it's not making a cut or anything, so it's not like making a cut in the flesh to go against Torah, but it's leaving like marks in your arm. And you're meditating as you walk through the rest of the day, like, what happens in my prayer time. So I would be praying the Shema, right? Or in Daniel's 3 prayers, he prayed 3 times a day. I'd be praying that, and I walk away from my prayer time with it leaving me. My biggest challenge is when I leave my prayer time or study time, I tend to forget what I studied, and I get caught up in life. That's my biggest challenge. But when you have a physical reminder like, oh my, and I see the mark, the welt on my arm, right, where I tied it, I'm like reminded physically. It's a physical reminder. The spiritual command is on your heart and in your mind, but if you want to add a physical element to it, I would definitely suggest praying about tefillin.
Yeah, no, it's good points. All right, well, thank you everyone for hearing me, and Shabbat Shalom.